Hey there. Tonight, we journey into a darkness few have ever dared to imagine. Before the world became obsessed with serial killers, there was a man who perfected the craft. A charming ghost haunting the grandeur of the American Gilded Age. You are about to step into the long shadow of his legacy. A secret tucked away in the forgotten corners of history. Take a moment. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the gentle sounds of this story wash over you. If you followed our journeys before, you know that history holds truths they never taught you in school. And some of those truths are profoundly chilling. Tonight, we unravel the enigma of H.H. Holmes. He wasn't just a murderer. He was an architect of despair. The statistics alone are shocking. Estimates of his victims range from 20 to a horrifying 200. Imagine a single building, designed not for living, but for an efficient, silent end. This is the specific danger we explore. A labyrinthine murder castle in Chicago, built right as the world celebrated the 1893 World's Fair. Let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it? Knowing we're all sharing this quiet moment, separated by time and distance, makes this journey feel a little less lonely. So, dim the lights, and let the soft echo of the past begin. The final Pitezel child, young Howard, still traveled with Holmes, serving as a vital part of the continuing deception for Carrie Pitezel. Holmes knew he could not risk keeping the boy close to his mother or the now abandoned Canadian crime scene. After crossing back into the United States, Holmes took Howard to Indianapolis, Indiana, another temporary stop in his relentless pursuit of financial stability. Here, in a rented house, Holmes enacted his final, tragic cruelty upon the Pitezel family. The exact method of Howard's death is less clear than his sister's, but the result was the same. The boy vanished. Holmes allegedly dismembered Howard's body and burned the remains in a stove or furnace within the house, a brutal act designed to ensure total destruction of the evidence. Meanwhile, Holmes was preoccupied with his insurance scams, trying to convert his ill-gotten gains into untraceable cash, desperately seeking a way out of his mounting financial and legal crises. His paranoia was growing. He had committed a string of murders across multiple jurisdictions, including the USA and Canada, and he was constantly shifting his aliases and appearance. He knew that the only thing protecting him was the lack of communication between the fragmented police forces of the time. The specific danger now was that the truth of the scattered Pitezel family was about to be inadvertently exposed, not by a detective, but by a simple mistake in the convoluted mail system that connected Holmes's lies to Carrie Pitezel's heartbreak. The relentless travel with the Pitezel children was becoming an increasing burden and a logistical nightmare for Holmes. In the fall of 1894, while in Toronto, Canada, he began to view the children not as leverage, but as evidence and risk. The older girls, Alice and Nellie, were bright and perceptive. They had begun asking increasingly uncomfortable questions about their father and the constant need to move. Holmes knew he couldn't maintain the charade indefinitely. He found a secluded cottage outside the main city, assuring the girls that it was a safe place for them to stay while he continued to arrange their reunion with their father. This cottage, in reality, was the final stop. With chilling efficiency, he murdered the two girls, most likely via asphyxiation, a silent, untraceable method. He then buried their bodies in the basement of the rented property, believing the secluded location and the rapid return to the United States would ensure their remains would never be found. The complexity of his movements, crossing international borders, utilizing different aliases, and constantly sending confusing communications, made tracking his movements virtually impossible for the authorities at the time. The specific danger that stalked the children was the absolute, casual, disposable nature of their lives in Holmes's eyes. He had extinguished their lives simply to simplify his travel and eliminate two potential witnesses. Young Howard, the final child, was temporarily spared, only because Holmes still needed his presence as a distraction, a bargaining chip, and a tool in his ongoing narrative of the reunion. Having successfully collected the insurance money for Benjamin Pitezel's alleged death, Holmes moved swiftly to the next, most crucial phase of his deception, controlling Pitezel's family. Carrie Pitezel, a kind but overwhelmed woman, was told by Holmes that her husband was actually alive and in hiding in London to escape debts, and that Holmes was simply helping him manage his affairs and his children. Holmes convinced Carrie to entrust him with 3 of her 5 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under the guise of taking them on a grand tour of America and Europe, a journey meant to reunite them secretly with their father. Carrie, exhausted and emotionally vulnerable, agreed, believing she was acting in her children's best interest and securing their safety. This was a move of monstrous psychological cruelty. By separating the children from their mother and from one another, Holmes achieved total control. The specific danger was absolute isolation, making the children utterly reliant on the man who had just murdered their father. Holmes began a complex, meandering journey across the northern United States and into Canada, moving the children constantly between different cities: Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto, all while sending Carrie Pitezel carefully worded, confusing letters designed to track their non-existent reunion. Holmes enjoyed the perverse game of keeping the family physically close, yet psychologically fractured, always on the edge of a false hope.
The journey from Chicago was not an escape for H.H. Holmes, but a tactical retreat to execute his largest fraud yet, the Pitezel insurance scheme.
He arrived in Philadelphia, a city of history and quiet industry, where Benjamin Pitezel was waiting, under the pretense of being a new invention broker. The original, agreed-upon plan involved faking Pitezel's death for a $10,000 insurance payout, a significant sum for the time. Holmes, however, never intended to share the proceeds. He found a secluded house and, with cold, clinical precision, administered chloroform to Pitezel, rendering him unconscious. Then, in a moment of utter betrayal, he murdered his longtime accomplice by setting the body on fire, staging the scene to look like a tragic, accidental explosion of an experimental apparatus. Using his medical acumen, Holmes ensured the body was identifiable just enough to collect the insurance, but damaged enough to prevent a thorough autopsy. He even enlisted Pitezel's unsuspecting wife Carrie to identify the corpse, offering her a convincing web of lies about her husband's need to disappear for a grand future scheme. This act in Philadelphia marked a terrifying transition. Holmes was no longer confined to the castle. He had taken his methodical, silent violence on the road, turning the entire vast American landscape into his new, temporary killing ground. The shocking statistic of his potential victims grew by 1 more, this time, a former partner in crime. The insurance money was secure, but the complexity of his lies was about to multiply exponentially. By the end of the World's Fair in late 1893, Holmes found himself facing a serious financial squeeze. Despite the immense illicit income from fraud and the theft of his victims' assets, his extravagant spending, constant construction modifications, and mounting debts caught up to him. Creditors were circling. Suspicion was beginning to grow. Not about murder, but about unpaid bills. The intense scrutiny of the Chicago police and inspectors was too great a risk for the meticulous operator. The castle, his brilliant, deadly creation, was becoming a liability. It was time to leave. Holmes made a crucial decision: to abandon his fortress and use his existing fraud schemes to finance his escape. He had an extensive network of life insurance policies taken out on various individuals, including his key accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes's grandest scheme was to fake Pitezel's death, collect the substantial insurance payout, and split the money. They agreed to a plan. Pitezel would pose as an inventor who died in a staged explosion in Philadelphia. Holmes would collect the insurance, using his medical knowledge to provide a convincing body. However, the plan was a setup for a final, catastrophic betrayal. Holmes, ever the solitary actor, saw no reason to share the massive payoff. He decided to turn the staged death into a real one, eliminating his accomplice and securing the full sum for himself. With the castle now abandoned to the curiosity of creditors, Holmes prepared to leave Chicago. His destination, Philadelphia. This final, calculating treachery against his most trusted partner signaled the start of his nomadic, final chapter. A terrifying road trip across the country that would eventually lead to his capture. Nanny Williams's eventual fate was sadly predictable. After a period of uneasy residence in the castle, her growing suspicion about Minnie's true whereabouts, coupled with the impossibility of her returning to Texas without funds, made her another liability. Holmes's typical solution was swift and final. Like her sister, she was eliminated. The details of her death lost to the silence of the castle's hidden chambers. The Fort Worth property, however, remained the cornerstone of Holmes's next, larger financial endeavor. He had secured the deed and was preparing to capitalize on the real estate. To do this, he needed the assistance of Benjamin Pitezel, a trusted carpenter and longtime accomplice. Pitezel was crucial. He was reliable, greedy, and easily controlled by Holmes's superior intellect and constant supply of small-time criminal schemes. Pitezel was deeply involved in the construction and maintenance of the castle, knowing more about its hidden mechanics, the chutes, the gas lines, the secret passageways, than anyone outside of Holmes himself. He was the only one allowed access to the basement, which Holmes had converted into a horrifying quasi-surgical laboratory. This basement featured a dissection table, a crematory, and pits of quicklime and acid. The specific danger of the basement was not just death, but the absolute annihilation of all trace of identity. Pitezel's knowledge, however, was a double-edged sword. He was too familiar with Holmes's methods, and too involved in the fraud to ever truly walk away. Their partnership, cemented by shared criminality, was rapidly approaching a terminal point. Holmes never tolerated long-term partners. They always risked becoming witnesses. One of Holmes's next significant targets was Minnie Williams, a wealthy, solitary woman from Texas whom he had previously charmed and convinced to move to Chicago. Minnie was essential because she held the deeds to valuable property in Fort Worth, Texas, which Holmes coveted for his next grand scheme. He offered her a position as his personal stenographer and moved her into the castle, ensuring that her life and finances were fully integrated into his control. To secure the deeds, Holmes had Minnie legally transfer the properties to Alexander Bond, a fictional identity, a signature of his complex, multi-layered fraud. Minnie's presence was temporary, a means to an end, and she soon disappeared into the castle's labyrinth, becoming another silent statistic. To cover her absence, Holmes arranged for Minnie's younger, impressionable sister, Nanny Williams, to come to Chicago, believing she would join her sister. Nanny arrived full of hope, only to be manipulated into believing Minnie had suddenly departed on a secret journey, a lie she initially accepted. The cold truth, however, slowly began to dawn on her as Holmes's excuses grew thinner and his promises of reuniting them became more vague. Nanny, too, was now completely isolated, far from her Texas home, wholly dependent on the very man who had murdered her sister. Holmes's ability to orchestrate these intersecting deceptions, the financial fraud with one sister and the emotional manipulation with the other, revealed the depth of his psychopathy. This constant, intricate web of deceit required a brilliant, albeit evil mind to maintain, ensuring that no one could connect the dots between the disappearing money, the missing people, and the charming proprietor of the hotel. With the castle fully operational and his first domestic entanglements neatly resolved, Holmes shifted his attention to the looming spectacle of the World's Columbian Exposition. This event, opening in May 1893, was a beacon of progress and modernity, drawing over 27 million visitors. For Holmes, it was not a celebration, but a limitless supply chain of victims. The anonymity afforded by the sheer numbers was unprecedented. Tourists, newly arrived immigrants, wealthy investors, and solitary women seeking employment or adventure poured into Chicago. All were potential guests at his hotel. Holmes preyed on the naive and the aspirational. He specifically sought out young single women who were dazzled by his sophisticated charm and promises of employment or marriage. He used the legitimate businesses on the first floor, a jewelry store, a cigar shop, as subtle traps, hiring clerks and saleswomen who would then be offered accommodation upstairs. Once inside, the victims were stripped of their identities, their money, their valuables, and often their insurance policies, all meticulously cataloged by Holmes. The castle itself was the weapon. Victims could be gassed in their sleep, locked into a soundproof vault, or find themselves plummeting down a chute designed to land them directly in the basement. The vast, temporary population of the fair meant that a few dozen or even a few hundred disappearances would be lost in the city's overwhelming bustle. For a time, the castle was a perfect, self-sustaining killing machine, humming with dark efficiency right across the street from the hope and glory of the White City. The winter of 1891 brought the quiet, brutal end for Julia and her daughter Pearl. Julia had confided in Holmes that she was pregnant, a vulnerability that he ruthlessly exploited. He suggested a secret abortion, a procedure he insisted he could perform safely, away from prying eyes, utilizing his medical knowledge. This offer was, in reality, a meticulously planned execution. The quiet of the castle in the dead of winter provided the perfect cover. The official historical record suggests she died during the procedure, a plausible cover story for the time, which Holmes readily distributed to anyone who dared to ask. The details of Pearl's fate, the 8-year-old child, are even more heartbreakingly sparse, swallowed by the silence of the massive structure. Holmes, the ultimate insurance scammer, ensured that no trace of the bodies remained. His medical expertise allowed him to thoroughly clean and dissect the remains, which he then allegedly prepared for sale to medical schools. A grim, efficient way to profit from his own crimes, while ensuring their permanent disappearance. The specific danger of the castle was now fully realized. Its features were not only for trapping the living, but also for disposing of the dead with mechanical efficiency. This horrific double murder within the walls was the chilling baptism of the World's Fair Hotel. It proved to Holmes that his fortress was impenetrable, and that his methods of eliminating evidence were sound. The disappearance of a mistress and her child was easily smoothed over with lies about a sudden journey. The shocking statistic of his suspected victims, ranging up to 200, started with this quiet, calculated act of absolute betrayal. With this dark success, Holmes was emboldened, his confidence growing as the city outside bustled toward its celebratory exposition. With the hotel now operational, Holmes began the systematic collection of his staff, favoring young, often solitary women who lacked strong family ties in Chicago. This choice was strategic. They were less likely to be immediately missed, and their temporary presence in the city made their disappearance easily attributable to a sudden move or a quick return home. One such employee was a young woman named Julia Connor, who worked as a clerk in his drugstore. Julia's life became intertwined with the proprietor's manipulative charm. Holmes, the practiced seducer, quickly began an affair with her, an action that cemented her proximity and control. He moved her and her daughter Pearl into an apartment on the second floor of the castle. This relationship was not about affection. It was a matter of logistics and access. Julia represented the perfect victim, present, vulnerable, and completely isolated within the walls of the predator's lair. As the World's Fair drew nearer, Holmes's net widened, but his focus on Julia and her daughter intensified. The reality of their entrapment was silent. Living within the very structure designed for murder, they were perhaps the most immediate and horrifyingly accessible victims. Julia was a necessary component to the smooth operation of the business, but she also knew too much about Holmes's casual financial crimes and the secrets of the construction. This intimate knowledge made her an unacceptable risk, a variable he needed to eliminate before the true influx of anonymous hotel guests arrived. The cold, calculating choice of a date for their end revealed the utter lack of humanity in the man known as Holmes. The building, now complete, stood as a behemoth in Englewood, a gleaming monument of modern brick and dark trim. Holmes officially titled it the World's Fair Hotel, a perfect, unassuming front to draw in the thousands of tourists and visitors flocking to Chicago for the exposition. The castle's exterior promised hospitality and convenience, but its interior was a masterpiece of lethal complexity. It boasted a drugstore and various shops on the ground floor, legitimate businesses that served as a reliable income stream and a cover for his movements. The upper floors, however, were labyrinthine. The second and third floors held over 100 rooms, many of which were soundproofed, had gas lines installed for specific purposes, or contained hidden peepholes. Some rooms were vaults, sealed with steel plates, accessible only from the outside. The hotel employed an elaborate system of false walls and confusing corridors, a maze from which the untrained eye could never find an exit. Holmes, the sole architect of this dark design, knew every twist, every lock, and every hidden passage. The specific danger here was one of profound disorientation. A guest could enter their room and unknowingly be trapped in a space that had been engineered for their silent, swift, and untraceable demise. The anticipation for the World's Fair was reaching a fever pitch, creating a perfect storm of anonymity. Thousands of people from across the country were pouring into the city, making every new face an untraceable, forgotten statistic. For Holmes, the opening of the hotel was not the launch of a business, but the initiation of a grand, terrifying experiment in human elimination. Mrs. Holton, the original owner of the drugstore, vanished with an unsettling lack of fanfare. Holmes, with his practiced air of polite efficiency, smoothly informed the neighbors that she had simply moved to California for her health. The explanation was just plausible enough, the kind of easy narrative people prefer to troubling questions. With Mrs. Holton gone, Holmes's financial machinations escalated. He quickly acquired the property, primarily through dubious mortgage schemes and carefully worded contracts. He then embarked on his most ambitious project, the construction of a sprawling, block-long, 3-story, mixed-use building that would come to be known only as the Castle. His method of construction was the first sinister hallmark of his genius. Holmes hired and fired countless construction crews, never allowing any single contractor or laborer to fully understand the building's complete blueprint. He paid the crews in a piecemeal fashion, often withholding final payments, ensuring that anyone who might protest or reveal his design flaws was kept constantly in flux. This rapid turnover served a crucial, dark purpose. It maintained total secrecy. No one worker ever grasped the logic of the disconnected staircases, the windowless rooms, the sealed vaults, or the strange, steeply angled chutes built into the structure. These were not mistakes. They were architectural features designed for control, confusion, and ultimate disposal. The air in Englewood was electric with the excitement of the coming World's Fair, and amid the noise of progress, Holmes was quietly building his fortress, a silent, deadly trap hidden in plain sight, a structure designed to isolate victims from the very idea of rescue. Leaving his studies in Michigan, where the murky business of insurance fraud and body manipulation had provided his first taste of illicit gain, Mudgett headed toward a larger, more promising stage, Chicago. The city was a roaring furnace of opportunity, aggressively expanding in preparation for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. This was the Gilded Age at its zenith, a time when ambition was a virtue and anonymity was easy to buy. Mudgett needed a clean slate, a new identity to match the grand scale of his burgeoning designs. He officially became Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a name that suggested both gravitas and a trustworthy professional background. He arrived in Englewood, a rapidly developing suburb of Chicago, and quickly found work at a drugstore owned by a widow named Mrs. E.S. Holton. Holmes possessed an almost hypnotic ability to earn trust instantly. His polite demeanor and seemingly earnest work ethic quickly won over Mrs. Holton. The store, a small brick structure on the corner of 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue, was more than just a place of employment. It was a foundation. Holmes soon began to subtly, then overtly, assert control over the business, recognizing the vulnerability of the lone owner. His goal was never just money. It was ownership, authority, and, most chillingly, the perfect location for a silent transformation. He secured an apartment upstairs, a simple lodging that allowed him to monitor the flow of business and the personal habits of everyone around him. This was his first true territorial claim in Chicago, a quiet conquest that few even noticed. In the quiet cobblestone streets of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a boy named Herman Webster Mudgett was taking his first steps toward a legendary darkness. The year was 1861, and the world outside was consumed by civil war. But within young Herman's mind, a colder, more personal conflict was beginning. He was drawn to the macabre with an unsettling curiosity. The innocence of childhood seemed to bypass him entirely. Whispers of his early encounters with a skeleton, forced upon him by cruel schoolmates, etched a profound shift in his psyche. This wasn't simple fear. It was a bizarre clinical fascination. Herman's intelligence was undeniable, a sharp tool he wielded with easy charm and a manipulative grace that masked an utter void of empathy. He devoured books, not for knowledge, but for strategy, learning how to dissect people's intentions and exploit their desires. His parents, pillars of the community, saw only a gifted son. They could never have conceived the monster he was meticulously constructing beneath a veneer of respectability. He learned early that the right appearance, the right words, and the right air of confidence could render him invisible to suspicion. It was a secret weapon, one he would perfect at the University of Michigan's medical department. This education provided more than a degree. It offered an intimate understanding of the human body and the means to manipulate it beyond recognition. The gentle, rolling hills of New Hampshire were soon replaced by the bustling energy of the city, and with the move, Herman Mudgett began to shed his skin, preparing to emerge as the notorious H. Holmes. The stage was set for a terrifying transformation. The first crack in Holmes's impenetrable facade appeared not in a hidden room or a dark alley, but through a simple yet fatal error in his planning. Holmes had partnered with another criminal associate named Marion Hedgepeth in St. Louis, Missouri, for an elaborate horse swindling scheme. The two had an agreement to split the profits. When Holmes failed to deliver Hedgepeth's share, the disgruntled accomplice retaliated. Hedgepeth, who was then in jail in St. Louis on unrelated charges, decided to inform the authorities about the insurance fraud involving Benjamin Pitezel. He detailed Holmes's plan to fake Pitezel's death and collect the insurance money. This information reached the ears of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the private investigative force that specialized in tracking criminals across state lines, where local police often failed. The Pinkertons immediately recognized the potential scope of the fraud and began a nationwide search for the elusive Dr. H. Holmes. This moment marked a critical shift. Holmes had moved from being an anonymous predator to a nationally wanted fugitive. The specific danger was that the Pinkertons had both the resources and the cross-jurisdictional authority that had previously been Holmes's greatest shield. The focus of the investigation was initially financial fraud, not murder, but the trail of Holmes's increasingly desperate and convoluted movements was about to expose the true depths of his horror. The Pinkertons quickly tracked Holmes's financial transactions and aliases, leading them to Boston, where he was ultimately apprehended in July 1894. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Holmes was taken into custody not for the murders, but for the minor financial crime of a horse swindle in St. Louis. However, the arrest was only the beginning of the end. Once Holmes was in custody and his connections to the vast Pitezel insurance scheme were established, the authorities knew they had a criminal of unusual sophistication. They were still focused on fraud, but the absence of the Pitezel children began to raise serious, unsettling questions. Detective Frank Geyer of the Pinkerton Agency was assigned the daunting task of unraveling the Pitezel family's complex cross-country trail. Geyer was a tenacious, methodical investigator, and his work became one of the greatest manhunts of the 19th century. He meticulously followed Holmes's deceitful path, using the confusing, geographically scattered letters Holmes had sent to Carrie Pitezel as his primary map. Geyer had to retrace every city, every address, and every false narrative Holmes had created. The survival statistics for the missing children were non-existent. Geyer began the search with the grim, sinking feeling that he was looking for more than just missing persons. The discovery of a receipt for a Toronto cottage rental became the first critical piece of physical evidence that would confirm his worst suspicions. Detective Frank Geyer's methodical investigation led him to Toronto, Canada, following the lead of the rental receipt. It was late 1894, and the air was cold and damp. The location was a secluded house that Holmes had rented under the alias Dr. H.D. Egan. Geyer, with the help of local authorities, began an exhaustive search of the property. The house yielded a chilling discovery in the basement, a disturbed section of earth beneath a stove. When the investigators dug, they discovered the badly decomposed bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. The site confirmed the horrible reality that the children had not been abandoned or reunited with their father, but murdered. The location-specific details of the small cottage basement, the silent grave beneath the stove, spoke volumes about the casual brutality of their killer. The realization that this supposed Dr. Egan was in fact H.H. Holmes, the man already in custody for fraud, sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The search had officially shifted from a financial fraud case to a multi-jurisdictional murder investigation. Geyer, a seasoned detective, felt a profound personal commitment to finding the last missing child, Howard. The discovery in the Toronto basement transformed the entire case, proving that Holmes's crimes were not isolated incidents of fraud, but part of a terrifying, murderous pattern. Armed with the horrific evidence from Toronto, Detective Geyer continued his relentless pursuit, following the trail of the last Pitezel child, Howard. He used the confusing train tickets, hotel receipts, and the sporadic, deceitful letters Holmes had used to misdirect Carrie Pitezel. The trail led Geyer back into the heartland of America, specifically to Indianapolis, Indiana. This was the last known city where Holmes and Howard had been seen together. Geyer located the unassuming rented house on a quiet suburban street. He was now operating with the grim knowledge that he was searching for remains, not a living boy. The residents of the house were cooperative, and Geyer's attention was immediately drawn to a large, old-fashioned stove and chimney area. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, the air thick with the memory of a sudden, unnatural silence. The investigators found small fragments of bone and a few teeth in the chimney and the furnace, pieces that were positively identified as belonging to a young child. The discovery in Indianapolis confirmed the complete annihilation of the 3 Pitezel children. The shocking statistic of Holmes's victims had been horribly validated across state and international lines. Geyer had meticulously untangled the last, darkest threads of the Pitezel scheme, ensuring that Holmes would now face not just fraud charges, but the capital crime of murder. The evidence, though fragmented, was devastating. With the murder of the Pitezel children confirmed and evidence secured in multiple cities, the focus of the investigation broadened and inevitably led back to Chicago and the abandoned, mysterious structure known as the World's Fair Hotel. The Pinkertons and Chicago police converged on the building, which had stood empty and partially scavenged by creditors since Holmes fled. What they found inside transcended their worst fears about financial fraud and even simple murder. The search team discovered the castle's true, terrifying nature. It was an architectural death trap. They found soundproofed rooms, bricked-up sections, airtight vaults, and the network of hidden gas pipes leading directly into certain rooms. The famous chute leading to the basement was uncovered, along with evidence of the acid vats and quicklime pits Holmes had used for disposal. The sheer scale and ingenious design of the apparatus stunned the experienced detectives. It became clear that the castle was a facility, designed for the efficient processing and disappearance of human beings. The discovery lent credence to the highest shocking statistics of Holmes's potential victims, possibly hundreds who had vanished without a trace during the World's Fair. The press seized on the story, immediately labeling the structure the Murder Castle, turning Holmes into a national sensation, the first true American serial killer. This final, horrifying structural evidence provided the motive and means for the mass disappearances in Chicago. As the evidence mounted, Holmes, despite being held in Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia for the horse swindle, remained the ultimate unreliable narrator. He was charming, manipulative, and a master of weaving plausible lies. He began to sell his story to the eager press, and, more critically, to the district attorney's office. His goal was not to confess, but to confuse and deflect, creating so many contradictory narratives that the core truth would be lost. He offered sensational but false confessions about various murders, claiming to have killed people who were later found alive, essentially poisoning the investigative well. He eventually agreed to be interviewed by a team of journalists, where he admitted to a fantastical 27 murders, later retracting the statement. His final official memoir, written in prison, was a masterpiece of self-exoneration, painting himself as the victim of circumstances and a misunderstanding of his complex business dealings. This refusal to admit the truth, and his constant shifting of the narrative, became a final, maddening aspect of his control. He delighted in creating a cloud of uncertainty around the actual survival statistics of his victims. Even his ultimate conviction for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel was based on the undeniable evidence of the Pitezel Children's Trail, not a confession. His voice, though physically confined, continued to manipulate the national perception of his crimes. The legal focus solidified on the single most provable crime, the murder of Benjamin Pitezel in Philadelphia. The Pitezel case provided a clear line of evidence: the insurance fraud, the staged explosion, the body, and most critically, the undeniable physical evidence of the children's graves confirmed across 3 separate jurisdictions. The prosecution understood that trying Holmes for the countless, unprovable murders in the Chicago castle would be impossible, given the lack of identified remains and the complexity of the labyrinthine building. They needed to anchor the case on one firm, undeniable act of premeditated murder. The trial began in October 1895 in Philadelphia. Holmes, showing his characteristic arrogance, chose to represent himself initially, a move that allowed him to manipulate the proceedings and grandstand for the press. He cross-examined witnesses, spinning sophisticated legal arguments and attempting to cast doubt on the identification of the body and the Pitezel children's movements. This spectacle only served to highlight his cold, calculating nature. He was eventually convinced to accept legal counsel, but the image of the killer arguing his own case was cemented in the public mind. The prosecution's evidence, painstakingly gathered by Detective Geyer, was overwhelming, clearly establishing motive, means, and the systematic disposal of the accomplice and his children. The testimony of Carrie Pitezel, the widow, proved to be the most emotionally devastating element of the trial. She recounted the manipulative lies Holmes had told her, the false hopes he had peddled about her husband and children's safety, and the agony of discovering the truth from the police. Her description of the confusing letters and Holmes's charming duplicity painted a clear picture of his psychological cruelty and control. Furthermore, the testimony of Detective Frank Geyer detailed the grueling cross-country hunt for the missing family, connecting the dots from Philadelphia to Toronto to Indianapolis, presenting the physical evidence of the children's remains. Geyer's methodical, sober account contrasted sharply with Holmes's fantastical defenses. The jury was faced with 2 clear narratives: Holmes's self-serving claims of an elaborate misunderstanding, or the cold, undeniable trail of bodies and financial fraud. The evidence was simply too firm, too geographically widespread, and too intertwined with Holmes's distinct aliases and financial moves to ignore. The jury, after a relatively short deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murdering Benjamin Pitezel. The verdict was a validation of the police work and a final judgment against the man who had perfected the art of the undetectable crime. Following the guilty verdict for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, H.H. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentencing, though swift, did not quiet the public's fascination with the man who had built a murder castle in their midst. In the months leading up to his execution, Holmes remained a focus of sensational journalism. The press, eager for details of the horrors of the castle, continued to press him for a full confession. He played to this attention, offering a final, definitive confession for the Philadelphia Inquirer in exchange for $10,000. This document, published shortly before his death, was a masterclass in ambiguity. In it, Holmes claimed to have murdered 27 people, many of whom were fictitious or later found alive, while simultaneously completely denying the murder of the Pitezel children. He was deliberately attempting to confuse the historical record, ensuring that the true number of his victims and the full story of the castle would remain permanently obscured. The shocking statistic of 27 confirmed nothing, but it captivated a public hungry for the gruesome details of the Gilded Age's darkest secret. Ultimately, his final confession was not a moment of moral clarity, but a final act of psychological manipulation, an attempt to control his legacy even from the grave. The execution of H.H. Holmes took place on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in his final moments, Holmes displayed an almost bizarre composure. He requested a closed casket and that his body be buried deep in cement, a final act of control stemming from a deep, irrational fear that his corpse would be mutilated by scientists or morbid spectators. This final, personal request spoke volumes about his deep-seated psychological need to disappear completely, a need that had fueled his entire career of untraceable murder. The execution was carried out with the somber formality of the era. The man who had once been the charming proprietor of a grand hotel, and later the elusive killer on a cross-country rampage, met his end quietly on the gallows. His death brought a sense of finality to the horrific chapter, but it did not and could not provide full closure. The true number of his victims remained unknown, forever lost to the Chicago castle's furnaces and pits. The physical death of Holmes was simple. The death of the mystery surrounding his crimes was not. The survival statistics for those who entered the castle remained a terrible, open-ended question. The story of H.H. Holmes moved from a police file to a grim American legend, cementing his place as one of the most terrifying figures of the 19th century. Following Holmes's execution, the infamous Murder Castle in Chicago became a national curiosity and a grotesque tourist attraction. Crowds flocked to the Inglewood neighborhood, eager to catch a glimpse of the building that had housed such unspeakable horrors. The building, abandoned and a reminder of the city's dark secrets, was a massive liability. Local authorities wrestled with what to do with the monument to murder. Then, in August 1895, under mysterious circumstances, the castle caught fire. The blaze ravaged the upper 2 floors of the structure, effectively destroying the labyrinthine, deadly architecture that had made Holmes's crimes possible. The origin of the fire was never definitively proven, though rumors of arson by disgruntled creditors or fearful locals persisted. The fire was seen by many as a symbolic act of cleansing, an attempt to erase the memory and the physical evidence of the horrors contained within its walls. The ruined structure was eventually demolished, its bricks and debris scattered, ensuring that no physical piece of the murder castle remained intact. This act removed the location-specific details that had been so vital to Holmes's method. However, the demolition could not erase the legend. The castle's existence left a permanent scar on Chicago's optimistic image. A dark reminder that beneath the gilded facade of progress, pure, cold evil had found a permanent home. The story of H.H. Holmes transcended a simple criminal case. It became a deep-seated cultural obsession in the late 19th century, profoundly changing the national perception of the Gilded Age. The era, often celebrated for its industrial progress and glittering wealth, was now stained by the realization that such evil could be hidden in plain sight, protected by anonymity and ambition. Holmes's method of operation, targeting those without strong community ties, utilizing sophisticated financial schemes, and leveraging the sheer size of the World's Fair crowds, highlighted the specific dangers of modern urban life. People realized that their neighbors could be absolute strangers, and that trust could be a lethal weakness. Holmes forced a chilling societal introspection. He exposed the dark underbelly of a society obsessed with image and rapid development. The term serial killer, though not formally used at the time, was conceptually born in the public's understanding of the man who created a factory for murder. His case served as a dark historical figure landmark, marking the moment when the nation understood that individual monsters, not just external wars or plagues, posed a profound and terrifying threat. The aftermath of the Holmes case brought lasting changes to American law enforcement. Detective Frank Geyer's meticulous cross-country work, following a trail of deception across Philadelphia, Toronto, and Indianapolis, highlighted the urgent need for better interjurisdictional cooperation. At the time, local police departments rarely shared information, which had allowed Holmes to operate seamlessly across state lines for years. The Pitezel investigation, however, proved that complex, geographically widespread crimes required a unified effort. The Pinkerton Agency, by showcasing its national reach, demonstrated a model for future federal law enforcement. The Holmes case became a stark example used to argue for the creation of national criminal databases and improved communication protocols. The sheer impossibility of identifying the number of victims from the Chicago castle due to the lack of centralized records also pushed for better tracking of missing persons. While these changes were slow in coming, the realization that an individual could vanish without a trace in a modern city like Chicago was a powerful catalyst for reform. The case left an indelible mark on how America viewed its own internal security and the need to connect seemingly unrelated crimes. The legacy of H.H. Holmes continues to haunt popular culture. The image of the charming, educated doctor who built a home designed for torture and murder remains a powerful and terrifying archetype. His story has been adapted countless times in books, films, and television, often blurring the lines between established historical fact and sensationalized fiction. The most enduring myth is the murder castle itself. While the building was a labyrinthine structure designed to facilitate murder, the popular narrative often exaggerates its features, describing trapdoors and sophisticated torture devices that were likely unnecessary for Holmes's primary method of gas asphyxiation and quick disposal. This fascination speaks to a cultural need to understand, yet also to embellish, absolute evil. It is a cautionary tale about the deceptive nature of appearances. The historical figure of Herman Mudgett, the small-town boy who became H.H. Holmes, serves as a constant reminder that the greatest darkness often wears the most polite, educated mask. The blurring of history and legend is a direct result of Holmes's own final manipulative efforts to confuse the record. His successful bid to be remembered not as a simple murderer, but as a grandiose, almost mythological figure endures. Even today, the question remains: how many people did H.H. Holmes truly kill? The official conviction was for one, Benjamin Pitezel. The confirmed bodies were 4, Pitezel and the 3 children. Yet the architectural evidence of the Chicago castle, the confirmed disappearances of staff like Julia Connor and the Williams sisters, and the countless untraceable World's Fair visitors point to a far higher, shocking statistic. Estimates from the Pinkertons ranged from 20 to over 200. The truth is likely somewhere in that terrifying range, but will never be known with certainty. The victims of the castle remain a spectral group, forever lost to the records of the 19th century. This lack of certainty is perhaps the most enduring horror of the case. Holmes designed his life and his building to ensure the survival statistics for his victims were zero, and his own accountability was minimal. His success in achieving this level of untraceable murder is what makes him so unique and so terrifying. The case serves as a powerful historical lesson about the need for rigor in documentation and the terrible consequences of allowing large-scale human anonymity to flourish unchecked. And so, we leave the long shadow of H.H. Holmes. His story is not just one of murder, but of a brilliant mind twisted by a complete absence of conscience, utilizing the very architecture and ambition of the Gilded Age as his weapon. He stands as a dark historical figure, a frightening testament to the power of deception and the fragility of trust. The physical castle is gone, reduced to ash and rubble in Chicago, but the psychological impact of his crimes endures. Tonight, we have traveled through the most unsettling chapter of American history, witnessing the quiet, methodical work of a monster who hid in plain sight. As the light in your room fades, take a moment to absorb the finality of this tale. The world has changed dramatically since 1896, and the systems of justice are more connected, more vigilant. Yet, the lesson of Holmes remains. Be mindful of those who offer too much too soon, and remember that sometimes the greatest dangers are hidden behind the most charming, respectable facade. So, allow the tension of this documentary journey to soften now. The past is secure, the villain is contained. The horror is over. The secrets are uncovered. The night is quiet now. You are safe. Close your eyes, let your breath slow, and know that some of history's darkest stories are best left softly in the dark. Sleep well, and we'll meet again in the quiet hours for another chapter of history they never taught you in school. Sweet dreams. The journey into the chilling reality of H.H. Holmes, the architect of the Murder Castle, has reached its quiet conclusion. We've witnessed the rise and fall of a man who used charm, ambition, and the chaos of the Gilded Age to commit some of history's most terrifying crimes. Take a deep breath now. The shadows of Chicago's past are far away, and the dangers detailed in this story are contained in the history books. We spoke of specific dangers, the calculated anonymity of the city, and the chilling truth that those close to you, like Benjamin Pitezel and his children, were the most vulnerable. The shocking statistics about the missing people who vanished during the World's Fair remain a haunting question mark, a testament to how easily lives could be erased before modern forensics and interconnected law enforcement existed. Remember that you are safe in this moment. The trial concluded in Philadelphia, and the historical figure who created such darkness met his end. The castle itself was reduced to ashes, and the silent evidence is now sealed. I hope that learning this true, untold history has given you a deeper understanding of the world, even its darker corners. If this quiet journey into the past brought you a sense of calm or curiosity, please let me know in the comments. Reassure the listener, fade the final imagery, and close on a calming whisper. Dim the lights just a little more. You've navigated the shadows with bravery tonight. Let the soft music guide you toward rest. Sleep well.